All right, I think we will get underway here. This is the, what is this? Sexuality and blah, 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 blah in Lovecraft. Many people might think, is there even anything to talk about at this panel? Lovecraft himself was very asexual. I think that's a correct assessment. And it might seem as if there's almost nothing sexual in Lovecraft's stories, but I believe we will find that that's very much mistaken, very mistaken indeed. Not that Lovecraft's going to be another Henry Miller, but there's some stuff there that's indeed very interesting.
It's just subtle.
That's right. But I think it's true that Lovecraft, at least for much of his life, himself scorned sex, anything relating to sex, maybe even was a bit frightened of women, perhaps, always kind of held them at a distance. He did marry, of course, we can get into that later, but I want to read you at least one pungent passage early in his life about his attitudes towards sex. This is written in 1920, a letter written in 1920 to his friend Reinhard Kleiner. Eroticism belongs to a lower order of instincts and is an animal rather than a nobly human quality. For evolved man, the apex of organic progress on the earth, what branch of reflection is more fitting than that which occupies only his higher and exclusively human faculties? The primal savage or ape merely looks at his native forest to find a mate. The exalted Aryan, any Aryans around here, should lift his eyes to the worlds of space and consider his relation to infinity. 2 exclamation marks. Yes. About romance and affection, I have never felt the slightest interest, whereas the sky, with its tale of eternities past and to come, and its gorgeous panoply of whirling universes, has always held me enthralled. And in truth, is this not the natural attitude of an analytical mind? What is a beauteous nymph? A woman, that is. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, a dash or two of phosphorus and other elements, all to decay soon. No offense to anybody on this panel. But what is the cosmos? What is the secret of time, space, and the things that lie beyond time and space? What sinister forces hurl through the black and curious ether these titanic globes of living flame and the insect-peopled worlds that hover about them? Here at last is something worthy of the interest of enlightened mankind, etc., etc. Well, I think it's obvious from that Lovecraft himself is parodying, in some sense, his own lack of interest in sex and his focus on the cosmos. Because as we find through his writing, we will find abundant evidences that there is sexuality in his stories. I think we'll start this panel by having everybody introduce themselves, and then structurally, I hate moderating, by the way. I will not moderate. I refuse to moderate. I want a free-flowing discussion, maybe starting generally with Lovecraft's own attitudes, moving on to his fiction, and then perhaps moving on even to the writings of later Lovecraftian writers, including many of the people on this very panel, and their discussions of sex in their stories. So let's proceed at this end.
Hi, I'm S.J. Chambers. I'm co-author of the Hugo-nominated Book Bible, and I'm also an independent prose scholar, so I'm actually here via poem as opposed to Lovecraft.
I'm Kiernan. I've written a hellish number of things. I'm definitely lower order of life. I'm very horny. I think I masturbated last night. So obviously I should be here.
I'm Joshi. I have studied Mr. Lovecraft's sexuality, what there is of it in various documents left by his wife and by others, and we can go into that later. Maybe. Go into it. Sorry, there's going to be a lot of puns in this panel.
I'm what's left of Lois Gresh after the weekend, thanks to some people up here who kept me up till about 3 last night.
Yeah, sorry.
I've published something like 60 stories, all of which are dark, some kind of science fiction fantasy, horror,
I'm W.H. Pugmire, and I am a gay Lovecraft fanboy. Hooray.
So let's start with Lovecraft himself. I think we also forget that Lovecraft really didn't remain stationary in his views. I have another huge letter that I'm not going to quote, but Lovecraft's views did evolve over the course of his lifetime in this regard. For example, early in his life, he did seem to scorn women's intellects. There's a famous passage that he compares women's minds to baby lisping. But later on in life, he did, acknowledge sensibly that there's no reason to think women aren't as smart as men and, can't do just as good work in the intellectual sphere. So, does anybody have anything to say about Lovecraft, the man, and his sexual attitudes?
As a gay Lovecraftian writer, I'm often asked if I thought Lovecraft was gay or closeted. I do not. I think he was authentically repulsed by the idea of gay sexuality, sodomy. He was repulsed by effeminate men. And yet he had a lot of gay friends, it seems. I believe that Samuel Loveland took him to parties that were substantially gay men, gay poets, writers. And Lovecraft, in his stories and in his fiction, often expresses an admiration for masculine beauty. So, but I don't think he was in any way homosexual. I think the idea of sex was simply irrelevant to him. And when he was married, his wife described him as an adequately excellent lover, which does not sound enthusiastic.
No sense. So, if there's anything more oxymoronic than that, I don't know what is.
I do agree. I don't think it's working.
It was working earlier. I agree that I don't believe that Lovecraft was gay. I think that's sort of a lazy default to explain things. But I think in sort of opposition to what Wilum said, I think he was absolutely obsessed with sex, and it especially shows later in his work. The Shadow over Innsmouth is a story about sex, and specifically it's a story about everything he was afraid of about sex, everything that horrified him. It's a story about miscegenation, it's a story about bestiality. The Thing on the Doorstep can be read as a story about transgenderism. So I think he was utterly obsessed with this thing, like with most things that horrified him and placed him in a sense of awe. And by that I mean the older meaning of the word awe, awful. If it fills you with awe, and awe is not necessarily a good thing.
The one thing we can say, though, is that Lovecraft, even at a fairly early age, even if he disliked sexual phenomena, because he was raised in a Victorian environment. He was born 1890, still in the last flowering of the Victorian age in England and in the U.S. here. Sex was not talked about. It was considered dirty. It had to be kept under the table. You didn't refer to a piano legs. You have to refer to them as piano limbs. Pianos didn't have legs. Women didn't have legs either. So things like that. And I think let's be honest, his upbringing certainly did not lead him to embrace sex as a positive value. What happened to his father? Contracted syphilis in had contracted syphilis some years probably before. Broke down in a Chicago hotel room in 1893, was interred in Butler Hospital down the block there, and died in 1898. Now you have to understand, though, that we didn't know what syphilis was, really speaking, or rather we didn't know the cause of syphilis, the bacterial cause of syphilis at that time. That was only identified in 1911, long after Lovecraft's father had died. But I believe that everyone knew that something rather unsavory had happened to Mr. Lovecraft Sr., and I think his mother in particular was supremely traumatized by what had happened to her husband. And from then on, it would appear that she had this strange love-hate relationship with her own son, maybe fearful that he himself would become like his father. Around the age when he was about 16, 17, 18, it's not clear when, but she would tell a neighbor that Lovecraft had a hideous face, and that's why he went around and, with his, coat collar up to his ears and not look anybody in the face. Whether Lovecraft knew that, I don't, whether he knew she had made that remark, I don't know. He might have. That couldn't have done much for his self-esteem. And yet, in other ways, she was vastly overprotective of him and wouldn't let him lead a normal life, coddled him. And in fact, it's funny because finally when she died, she herself died in Butler, she broke down in 1919, chiefly because of financial worries, I think largely because she realized that Lovecraft himself, who was 29 years old at the time, wasn't making a living and might not be able to support himself. The medical records say that financial worries were a major cause of her breakdown. And then she died in 1921. Lovecraft initially was overwhelmed. I'm sure he loved his mother and was very much attached to her, had become, they had become kind of fixture, she had become a fixture in his life, living alone there in this house in 598 Angel Street. So initially he reacted with trauma, but got over it pretty quickly. And then, a few weeks later met Sonia Green, who would become his wife. But that story, the thing on Doorstep, is very interesting because at the outset it talks about Edward Derby, the young Edward Derby, and that his mother, when his mother died, he went into his trauma, but then felt a sort of weird exaltation as if he'd been liberated. I think Lovecraft knew he was writing about himself then. So I think he understood the generally harmful effect that his mother had had on him, in particular in regard to his relations with women.
Well, he did tell his wife that no one had ever expressed affection to him since he was an infant, that his mother had really twisted his mind. Is it working?
Yes, you need to talk into it.
Oh,
Thank
you're like that?
Wonderful.
No, okay, after
You
repeat
have to
that.
be a singer, you have to lip to the mic.
Oh, God. Well, he did famously tell his wife that he hadn't had any affection since he was an infant, that his mother had never touched him or kissed him or anything since he wasn't, who remembers what life is like when you're literally, 8 days old or something, so he just wasn't used to it. There's a photograph in the dealer's room at Jared's table. I saw it. There's a nice book. All of his books are great. There's photographs of Lovecraft. I looked through all of the photos. There was one I'd never seen before, though some of you may have. And it showed Sonia hugging him, like this. And he is like, if you were to hug me, he's like pinching and, shifting away. It's a very instructive photo. And he did say that he learned about sex from medical textbooks
Oh, yes.
in the family library.
Oh, yeah.
And that this is what turned him on to sex at a very early age.
Well, it's funny, I just quoted that remark about the Lovecraft, his mother saying he had a hideous face. Well, when he and Sonia were sort of courting, one incident she records fairly at the outset. I mean, they weren't even considered a couple, really speaking, although it's clear that Sonia had her eye on him. And at some gathering or other, Lovecraft was stroking a cat. He loved cats. He said, so he's basically making love to this cat, in essence. And Sonia says, "Oh, well, why are you paying so much attention to this cat when a woman would highly appreciate it?" And Lovecraft says, "How can any woman love a face like mine?" So clearly he would remember that. But then Sonia replied in a most unfortunate manner. She says, "Oh, a mother would." Well, not Lovecraft's mother. But then she goes, and many other people who aren't mothers. Clearly she had her eye on Lovecraft right at the outset.
Of course, even after she wanted the divorce, he wanted to stay married and just have the marriage through letters. Live apart, just correspond.
A man does not
sex.
divorce his wife without cause.
He said.
He felt he had no cause to divorce her.
Well, wasn't there an economical issue too? Like, wasn't she making more money than she was?
He was making all the money,
She was making
in essence.
And he had a lot of guilt from that too.
I think so. He had to borrow, not borrow, but yeah, that New York period was very stressful.
And he had his weird tails checks sent to his aunts, and then they sent him into return the money, you know, doled it out as if he
$5
was,
increments.
yeah, as if he, and he sent his shoes home to get polished and whatnot to the aunts. So I think he needed a lot of mothering.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, the problem there is that Lovecraft was never trained in an occupation. He should have received some kind of training. But remember, he dropped out of high school, and he was eternally ashamed of not having even a high school diploma, let alone going to Brown. He had expected to go to Brown and get a college degree and maybe become an astronomer. That all was dashed when he dropped out of high school. But the family never had him trained in any sort of humble occupation, a clerk or whatever, and Lovecraft said, oh, well, I thought I could always just sell a story or a poem or something and make a living that way, but he didn't write enough, or at least not enough saleable material. So he had to rely on his, his paltry inheritance from a grandfather, and he married Sonia, and she was a very, very highly paid executive at that time, in the clothing trade, specifically hat making, a milliner. She was a very accomplished milliner. But then she ran into financial troubles, and she had some health problems that then eventually forced her to move to the Midwest, and she worked in Cleveland and left Lovecraft alone in New York City, and that was just the worst thing in the world for him, because he was now isolated in this place that he hated and didn't know how to get out of it. He had very little money. I mean, he had his friends, but he basically started almost cracking up. And that's when we get these really anguished letters that he writes to his aunts about how miserable he is. Wow. But let's move on to Lovecraft's work. For all that he may have had a problematic life in terms of his relations to fiction, to women, and to men for that matter, there is a lot of covert sexuality in Lovecraft. I think going back, Shadow of Innsmouth had its origin in some senses in that early story, Facts Concerning the Late Arthur German and His Family, which is also about miscegenation there, where you have a white ape as the ultimate ancestor of this aristocratic line of the Germans, who are, all a little odd. Maybe there's something called the German look, in effect, that they all manifest. But that's, again, without saying it, Lovecraft's telling you that this line formed by humans mating with this white ape. I mean, that's pretty twisted.
And of course, it's the root of the Danatar.
That's right, where a god mates with a hapless human female. He got that idea, of course, from Mackenz's great god Pan, but nevertheless, he's pretty clear about what goes on. And then this poor woman is never the same after Yog-Sothoth deals with her. But what about other stories? Are there other stories? I think Thing on the Doorstep is fascinating.
It seems like every story, I don't know, it seems like every story by Lovecraft that I pick up, I can see it. And it's rarely, it's not always as in your face as The Shadow over Innsmouth or The Danatar, but it's always lurking there somewhere. This fear of falling prey to your animal desires and it leading to some sort of social cataclysm.
Call of Cthulhu has a scene in the Louisiana backwoods where he specifically mentions orgies, I believe, among the Cthulhu cultists. It's a small scene, but it's pretty clear what they were doing.
Thing on the Doorstep is fascinating because we cannot imagine the honeymoon of Edward and Asnath. She was perhaps possessed by the soul of her father, and yet wasn't her father actually possessed by Kumar, the demon? So we don't know exactly what it was that possessed this woman, but still it's the idea. There was a passage in that story that I took offense to for a longest time, where it said that Asnath wanted to be a man, to be fully human. And I thought, what, women are not human? But I think actually that refers to her being of the Innsmouth race, and that she wanted to possess her husband so that she would not succumb to becoming a deep ones, but she wanted to be fully human so that she could. I don't exactly know why, but I think that's what that line refers to.
Yes.
It's not meaning that women are only half men or whatever. So it's an interesting line.
There are a lot of works that may have inspired or gone into the thing on the doorstep. One of them, a very interesting work, which Hippocampus has reprinted, and I urge you to read it, is Barry Payne's novel, An Exchange of Souls, which again has this idea of a man and a woman exchanging souls, minds, personalities, whatever you have it. There, what happens is that a man contrives a machine that will effect this exchange between him and his wife. But in the course of doing that, I mean, it's a kind of contrived plot, but the machine happens to break down, and then the man's body dies, leaving the woman in possession of the woman's mind. The woman's body has the man's mind in it, and this person spends the rest of his life, his or her life, trying to reconstruct the machine so that some sort of re-exchange can occur, but it never does. Essentially the same idea in the thing on the doorstep, and it would certainly have been very interesting if Lovecraft had reflected upon what it means for a man's mind to be in a woman's body, or a woman's mind to be in a man's body.
Do you think, ST, I've never thought of it because it's really fascinating. Do you happen to think that perhaps he wrote about all these things and he thought about all these things because he felt somewhere inside that he was sort of twisted? Did he recognize it? Do you think?
I don't know about that. Not in that particular story. I think Asenath shares qualities with his mother, shares qualities with Sonia. He may have been trying to write about them in a sort of covert way. Derby himself, in my mind, is not Lovecraft. He actually shares character traits with some of Lovecraft's friends. He's a precocious poet, and the way Lovecraft writes about him suggests that Lovecraft actually is thinking of Clark Ashton Smith. Other elements of Derby's character remind you of other of Lovecraft's younger friends like Alfred Galpin or Frank Belknap Long. So I don't think he was really writing about himself in that particular story.
We also remember that I believe when Lovecraft was a child, he was encouraged to describe himself as, I'm a little girl. And I don't know.
Well, how long, I mean, it wasn't unusual for young boys to be dressed in dresses, frocks for the first few years of their life, but didn't that go on a little bit longer?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the average was, but certainly Lovecraft was still in frocks by the age of 4, but I've never felt there was any particular gender confusion on Lovecraft's part, because certainly by the age of 6, there's a famous photograph of Lovecraft as a boy of 6, and he's, he has the short hair and the short pants and a shirt. He just look like any other normal boy. And in fact, he insisted at the age of about 6 that these long flowing curls that he had should be cut off. And his mother cried when that happened and saved at least one lock of his hair. I mean, we know that his mother wanted a girl, set up a hope chest in the expectation or hope that she would have a girl. Didn't happen, and whatever. But Lovecraft certainly asserted himself as a boy. He would had a lot of boy, friends in his youth. And as Wilum said, he did exhibit fairly quick disdain of anybody who suspected was a sissy.
It's a very antiquated idea of transsexualism that, your mother doted on you, your mother tried to make you a girl, whatever. And so I think, we sort of need to get over that, looking back at Lovecraft's childhood and his mother.
This is maybe tearing it a little bit away from the topic at hand, but when I read that story, what I find most interesting about it is the idea of evading childbirth. And I always find that interesting because there's always the Victorian fear of dying in childbirth, and I'm not sure that Lovecraft is necessarily writing with that sensibility of that woman's perspective. But it's really interesting because the concept of the alchemical marriage and the elixir of life and trying to transcend yourself through not birth, but it's the Frankensteinian notion of not having to have that carnal reproduction anymore. And I always found it interesting when I read that story that it's a way to embrace even the role of the women who are basically not even there. So I never really read it or have read any of the works in trying to identify themselves, or him trying to identify himself with the gender, but just kind of streamlining the discussion so we can talk more about his cosmology.
Well, you have to remember also that those stories of alien species like at the Mountains of Madness, and I think even Shadow of Time, those entities reproduced by spores.
Yes.
They have no sex. Lovecraft explicitly says that. They have no sex. That was a pure kind of civilization that perhaps
Given how aloof he was and indifferent toward people on the surface because he had been bullied, so he sort of had this facade out there, and he always said he hated all humans. And I pointed out, like, not just in
the abstract.
Yeah, you can sort of see somebody who was that put off by people, just in general, wishing they were all blown off the face of the earth, really would want that human contact. That would have lasted this guy. So.
Well, I mean, Lovecraft claimed he didn't hate anybody. In fact, he actually chided Donald Wandry for being a misanthrope. He says, the universe is not out to get you, guy. The universe doesn't care a damn about you.
Well, although he said he hated everybody, he had a lot of friends.
Well, I mean, those remarks...
He was charming.
Those remarks came sort of at bad times in his life. I don't think he actually hated people in the abstract. He just didn't care about them one way or the other.
He just considered that too ordinary. To try to develop the characters and write about them emotionally, that just wasn't a concern.
We also told his, I said this on a panel, whatever, the first day of his convention, seems like a million years ago. And in thinking of whether he was homosexual or not, I pointed out that when his heterosexual male friends told him, bragged about their exploits with all these women, how many they had bedded down or whatever, he wrote to them and said, this is disgusting, it's like, bestiality or whatever, it's, just base human stuff, you shouldn't be doing this. So he thought the heterosexual sex was just the same as homosexual. I think he was just totally asexual.
When I say that he wasn't interested in sex, what I meant was that he had no interest in getting laid.
Apparently had one sex partner, that was Sonia.
And, but yes, I completely agree with Caitlin that his fiction oozes with his sexuality.
Partner.
And I've tried to tap into that in my own Lovecraftian weird fiction.
Yeah, well, actually, before we move on, I do want to move on to other writers in the Lovecraftian tradition who have certainly come out much more explicitly on this subject. I think it's worth emphasizing that whatever Lovecraft felt about sex and felt especially about sex in literature, he was a strong opponent of censorship of sexual material, especially later on in life. In fact, even earlier on in life, he wrote an article in the amateur press around 1924 in which he defended books like Jurgen and Ulysses as what he called significant contributions to contemporary literature. Jurgen, as you know, was, by James Branch Cabell, was momentarily banned for obscenity when it was first published in 1919, and there was a furious campaign on the part of intellectuals like H.L. Mencken and Theodore Dreiser to have that ban overturned, and there was a famous court case that in the end did overturn the ban. Ulysses actually was banned in the U.S. from 1922 to 1933. You could not get that book in the U.S. Through ordinary channels. But Lovecraft said, that's foolish. Nobody's forcing you to read any of this stuff if you don't want to. In fact, a letter in 1930 is a long, long letter written to his friend Maurice Moe, who was very religious and I think was inclined towards censoring material that he found offensive, and especially in writing. And Lovecraft says, one thing about frank writing, remember that the authors and admirers of it don't expect anybody to read it all the time. It's only a fraction of the whole aesthetic field, and I can't yet understand why Victorians continue to single it out and make such a cursed hullabaloo over it. But I ought not to wonder at any attitude connected with the generations that produced cast iron lawn deer, the Boston City Hall, the poetry of Robert Browning, and side whiskers. As for me, I don't give a goddamn one way or the other. I own Boccaccio, but I read Poe, Dunsany, and Arthur Machen. What the hell? Well, very admirable and really...
You actually say, what the hell?
He said, what the hell?
That's so
He used slang in his letters. He generally didn't use slang in his speech. But,
Do we know the extent of his work on the Love of Dead?
No. No. Mr. Eddy, well, C.M. Eddy surely wrote a draft that Lovecraft looked over and revised. I wish we had the original manuscript or typescript that Lovecraft rewrote, but apparently we don't. Maybe there's a grandson of the Eddys who's still around here and claims he might have some documentation, but he's never made it available to anybody. The story certainly reads as if it's heavily written by Lovecraft, and at least here and there. And there's a famous scene where it quite explicitly talks about this guy who's obsessed with corpses actually having sex with a corpse. I mean, there's no doubt about what's happening at that particular point. And then he's because he works in a funeral home and things like that. And we know that story, when published in Weird Tales, caused that particular issue of Weird Tales to be banned, at least in the state of Indiana. We're not sure how wide that ban was, but Lovecraft does say it was banned in Indiana. I think in a sense, Lovecraft was having a bit of fun with that story. It was really so over the top, it was hard to take seriously, and he kind of got the spirit of it. Yeah. Now, I think a lot of the immediate writers in the Lovecraft tradition actually sort of follow Lovecraft in being kind of reserved about sex. I don't know that there's much sex in August Derlitz with those stories. Not that I can remember.
Well, there is Innsmouth Clay.
But that's a much later story.
Right.
It's pretty almost one of his last stories. How about Robert Bloch? Do you know anything?
He wrote about sex in his
Well, that's not
young-
Lovecraft.
no.
But yes. No, even in Bloch's Lovecraftian fiction, early and late, I don't remember all that much of this sort of.
His novels became kinky.
Yeah. Brian Lumley. He who shall not be named, but we'll talk about him a little bit.
He plays on the sexual thing. In Richard of the Deep Ones, he has a lot of nameless mating, I think, but it's not very convincing to me. So I'm not a big fan of Brian's work.
The James Wayne's The Deep Ones is
Right.
fairly explicit about, some sort of weird sex between humans and dolphins, I think it is. And I think it's actually a pretty good story. In fact, I intend to use that story reprint that story in this anthology that I put together called A Mountain Walk to Great Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, which I hope will come out later this year from Centipede Press, a big, huge volume of mythos stories from 1933 all the way up to the present day.
And then we have this singular case of Clark Ashton Smith, who was deeply sexual.
Smith was, he certainly was a ladies' man. In fact, I remember a remark he wrote a letter to George Sterling, whenever in the 20s, I think he says, I haven't gone out with an unmarried woman since I was 15.
Robert Howard is kind of problematic
Howard, yes.
in that sense. And definitely had that long, deep relationship with his mother.
Very much like Lovecraft,
Yeah.
And then the relationship with Novaline Price.
Yeah.
Also, I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but there's a lot of, I think, fairly explicit sexuality in Howard's, not necessarily his few Lovecraftian stories, but certainly in the Conan stories.
Fritz Leiber, is he?
Yeah, what do we get from Fritz? I can't think of much. He didn't write that many Lovecraftian stories anyway. So I think it's been left to the contemporary generation to draw out more explicitly the sexual elements that we do in fact find in Lovecraft's own work. So maybe Kate, talk about your own attitudes.
They're kind of weird. I started out for the first, I don't know, almost 10 years of my writing career, really not writing about sex and having a pretty negative attitude about writing about sex. I remember something that's been quoted a few times by people who really don't like me is one time I compared writing about sex about, lingering over someone going to the toilet. That it just tended to derail stories, and I kind of got over this around 2000, 2001, and began in 2005, William Schaefer of Subterranean Press and I were talking, and he said, well, if you wrote a collection of erotic stories, what would it be like? And I said, well, that's something new. And so I wrote a book called Frog Toes and Tentacles, which I think kind of speaks for itself in the title, of these little vignettes. And we produced this little, I wish I had a copy of it with me, we produced this really pretty little book that looks like a Victorian woman would keep it hidden somewhere. And it had a sequel called Tales from the Woeful Platypus. And then I began writing a tremendous amount of erotica, heavily influenced by a lot of Lovecraft, but very openly sexual, openly deviant, openly dealing with things like bestiality, in a, oh God, how can I say this without coming off as even as a bigger pervert than I am, in a positive sense. And just, I mean, I don't think at this point, because I've been doing this, I have this monthly PDF subscription-only thing called Serenia Digest, and it's almost exclusively devoted to erotica. It gives me the chance to keep writing erotica, and at this point, I don't think anyone in this room can name any, except maybe bronies, I don't think anybody in this room can name anything that I haven't done in the, I don't know, 100 and something stories that I've written for, and some of them are very short, some of them are very long, that I've written for Serenia Digest or for other markets, to the point that it's become difficult every month to think of something. And I'm definitely exploring topics that I started out with.
I was just thinking while you were talking, have I ever done an erotic story, based on Lovecraft? And back in the 90s, when I first started selling in 93, I only wrote weird fiction until I got my first book deal in 96, which was a thriller. So that was quite different. But one of the early stories was for a Nancy Kilpatrick anthology, and she wrote to me and said, they called me Weird Lois at the time. She said, I'd like you to represent weird fiction in this erotic horror anthology, which was not, a Lovecraftian anthology. I would be the only story representing the genre. And I, of course, the same thinking, I, of course, set it in Innsmouth. There's a rape scene. The main character is told from the point of view, third person, as I recall, female, who, she does have sex with some creatures from the sea. They're at the lip of the sea. She's out on a boat. Things happen. So that was an early one of mine. Now, I've returned to weird fiction from this other area the past few years. I'm writing basically only weird fiction again, and I'm trying to do it from different gender viewpoints. So I do. It's really easy for me to do female viewpoints, but I also try to do male viewpoints. I try to understand what it's like for them to give birth, to have their wives or whatever give birth, how they would feel. Like the story I wrote for you, in which the guy's child dies, the baby dies, which I read here yesterday, I guess it was. So I try to understand the different points of view. Oh, there was another one back in the 90s, one of my first stories, Instant Gratification, which was totally genderless. It was a sort of female blobbish character, a creature who just couldn't get off on her husband, this other blobbish creature, what he was doing, no matter what, they had tentacles sort of, that no matter what he did, it just didn't work. So she, it, whatever it was. He, of course, loved her. It's hard for me to say he or she for this story. And so I'll just say she because it's easier. Put plates, instant gratification plates in the ceiling and the walls and the floor, and like her tentacles all over the place. She could, get off on it, like 100 places at once. And he just really didn't like that. So that was an early one, I guess.
Well, before I let you talk about your own work, I think we have to remember one of the pioneering writers in modern weird fiction, Ramsey Campbell. As we all know, he started writing, as a teenager, these Lovecraftian passages, which quite frankly are pretty mediocre, kind of lively and fun, but again, very much like Lovecraft, very, very asexual. Male characters almost exclusively, doing the standard investigation of weird phenomena, etc., etc. After he wrote those stories, and they were published as The Inhabitant of the Lake, he sort of underwent a kind of, almost a revulsion against Lovecraft. Obviously he's come out of that now, but initially he sort of rejected Lovecraft as something that almost sort of held him back as a writer. And so for the next several years, he sort of was fishing around for how to do something different. And that's when he started writing those stories from the Demons by Daylight period. And in my judgment, that one volume, Demons by Daylight, which came out from Arkham House in '73, almost ushered in the contemporary age of weird fiction. They were written in a superbly contemporary voice. They dealt with, deeply with issues of interpersonal relations, and they were quite frank in their dealings with sexuality. There's a famous story. I think it's The Second Staircase, where again, it's not clear whether the person is a man or a woman, or a man becomes a woman, in a fascinating turn of events. Nothing exploitative, but all done with supreme artistry. And then, of course, Campbell went on to write he produced a whole collection of his weird erotica under the title Scared Stiff, Tales of Love and Death. Still a splendid, splendid volume. Those stories not explicitly Lovecraftian, but I think there is a Lovecraftian undercurrent to them. And I'm a great proponent of Campbell. I think he and Caitlin are probably the two leading writers of weird fiction of the last 50 years.
I wish you wouldn't say that in a big room full of people.
It's true. It's true. I said it because it's true. Anyway. Almost everything of Campbell's is worth reading, but his erotica, the weird erotica, really is very powerful. So, Will.
For me, sex is complete fantasy, because I've been celibate by choice since 1985. I don't like intimacy, and yet I am obsessed with sexual things. I was screwed up because when I was a kid, my father punished me, then he felt guilty, and so he kind of made love to me when I was a kid, and having him kiss me and rub his beard against my face, it really freaked me out, and it really damaged me. And then in the 70s, I worked the streets for 3 months as a male whore, and that was a horrifying experience. And so actual sex for me is repellent, and I'm totally screwed up in that. And yet I am obsessed with the idea of sex and with bringing images of sexuality into my fiction. And I don't really understand why that is, but I enjoy writing about it. But for me, it's just another aspect of fantasy. It's rather than being echoes of my reality.
I think that in finally turning to writing about sexuality in my own work, and it's also very present in my two most recent novels, The Red Tree and The Drowning Girl. We're not counting these Siobhan Quinn novels, was embracing the grotesque, what people consider the grotesque. For some reason, you made me think of this world. And I know it's been there all my life, I don't know where it came from. I don't care where it came from. It's been there since I was a child. I was very sexually precocious. My first sexual memories, and these are all, you know, I wasn't abused, nothing like that, but I know going back as far as, you know, 4 or 5, I had thoughts, and things that most people consider extraordinarily grotesque, repugnant, illegal, I find extremely erotic. And a lot of this, it's been this journey in writing my erotica, in essentially coming out. And I don't know how people read these, I don't know how they receive these, but I've always been very much a proponent of understanding authorial intent, and it is my intention in these stories, you know, I'm saying in these stories, that we have to, that it's important if these, you know, if we have these feelings, to embrace the grotesque, to embrace the other, which Lovecraft feared so much, the other. Lovecraft was an outsider. He thought of himself as an alien. And I have spent much of my life as an outsider and thinking of myself as an alien. I went through years of actually refusing to allow people to call me human. And so in doing this, and I'm extremely sexual, and so it's sort of the opposite.
Now, there have been anthologies, quite in fact fairly recently, of Lovecraftian sex. Cthulhu Erotica, I think, is one of them. I'm sorry to say I haven't read that book. Anybody have any opinions about the work in those volumes?
I haven't read it.
Isn't Cthulhu Sex a magazine?
Yeah, Cthulhu Sex.
Is there such a magazine? I don't know. There's so much out there. It's hard to keep track of.
I hope there's more to it than tentacles. That's all I have.
You know something interesting? That people have so fixated on Lovecraft and tentacles. Tentacles virtually do not appear in Lovecraft.
There are very few tentacles in Lovecraft.
I think people kind of grab hentai and glom it onto Lovecraft somehow to, I don't know, make hentai more respectable. I am a fan of hentai. I apologize.
Few tentacles, few testicles. So.
But no, I mean, I'll tell you, this whole issue, as I say, it seems as if there's nothing to talk about. There's a lot to talk about. I actually evaluated a manuscript a while back by somebody who was writing a book on sex and the Cthulhu mythos. It is a big book, and I've asked him to do some revision of it, and it'll probably get published in a year or two by Hippocampus. But he has a lot to say on the subject.
I want you to talk. What does he say?
Well, he starts with Lovecraft's attitudes, goes on to the fiction, and does a lot of work with the later writing. I'm sure he has a chapter. I know he has a chapter just on your work, Wilum. So I can't.
Perverse old thing that
I'll tell you, I can't remember the name of this guy, but I think he's a young English critic, and I'm sort of helping him with this book.
Kiernan, I asked this. You mentioned that you always felt like an alien. I went through a period in my late teens where I would look in the mirror and I wouldn't see a human either. And I thought of myself as an alien. Literally, I honestly did. And I wonder, I always felt like an outsider. Like I never fit into little cliques and whatnot. I have always felt like I get along with people, I think. I feel like, you have like subsets and bubbles, and usually they intersect, And I don't somehow intersect. I'm on the surface of the bubbles and I rub against the cliques, but I'm not in them. I felt kind of like an outsider and literally like an alien at times in my life. I wonder if the other writers of Lovecraftian fiction also have gone through periods feeling not human or feeling much like an outsider.
Every day, I am the outsider, but it's cool because I have found that in writing Lovecraftian horror, I can express everything that I am. And I can't think, for some reason, maybe this is peculiar to me, but I can't do that with any other genre. I can't imagine myself doing that with any other genre. But writing Lovecraftian fiction, and this is one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with doing it, is I can express everything that I feel and think and fear and will relish. It's all there. And and I'm totally addicted to it. So.
For me, it's not only coming from Lovecraft. I would also point to Angela Carter, and even classical writers of erotica like Anais Nin. So I can't just say, well, I'm writing Lovecraftian horror. I don't even really think of it as Lovecraftian horror, though it clearly often deals with a lot of the same genre elements.
Yeah, I haven't actually delved too deeply into my own Lovecraftian fiction, but I've written about 2 stories, and I tried to do the outsider perspective, and for me that's the women. So I don't necessarily deal with sex in the stories, but I do deal with women issues. So I guess even today as a writer, as a female writer, I feel like an outsider. When you go to, theme-specific things, it's easy to feel like an outsider. I don't think you ever achieve being comfortable in your own skin. I think that's a common human condition.
I don't want to sound like an asshole. Lord knows I don't want to sound like an asshole. Is Frank Woodward in here? Good. This I'll get back to him anyway. I was in his documentary, Lovecraft, Fear of the Unknown, which is a really fucking brilliant documentary, but it disturbed me that it was so male-dominated. I was like, God, there's got to be someone. Why isn't Joyce Carol Oates? Why isn't there someone in here besides me? And being, I'm gonna say it, being transgender. Okay, sure, there's someone really freaky in here, but where is there just a genetic woman? And I do feel like that to this little subgenre, the writing of women is kind of outside. There isn't. I think I'm as close as we come to there being a genuinely acknowledged woman who writes a lot of Lovecraftian fiction, which is just, in and of itself, in this age, it's weird, and I have to look back and wonder if in some part it's Lovecraft's original views on sexuality that have trickled down, and on women, that have trickled down.
I just want to tell you, I'm like genetically female.
Thank you.
I was confused about that.
But I'm not even ashamed of that. But I've been asked this weekend, I haven't counted it, at least 5 or 6 times in various on panels or outside calls, how I feel about being the only female writer of weird fiction. And then sometimes I qualify and say, of course we have Caitlin too, but that nobody else has ever mentioned. And I'm a kind of a minor figure, obviously. So, you're acknowledged as a female writer.
But if you go to...
and I'm like a minor character, and I wonder if I feel like an outsider.
And if there are people who say, well, why do you feel like an outsider? Why do you feel like an alien? You shouldn't feel that way. But if you go to the clip on YouTube that Frank put up of part of my interview, and I think it's an outtake, because they spent 3 hours interviewing me, and there's 5 or 10 minutes that they could only fit into the documentary. The comments, and of course, never fucking read the comments on the internet, but I do. And there's who is this weird person? Is this a woman? Is it a man? What's with that? I mean, it looks like a woman. What's with that voice? And even after all this time, and even after being so out, and even after writing everything I write, it's still extremely hurtful, and I hate that about myself, that I can't get over that reaction, and we come back to feeling like the other, feeling like the alien, writing the stuff that I do write.
Well,
God, you too.
I have a slight parallel to that. Oddly enough, even though I'm an immigrant to this country, I got here when I was 5 years old from India. I never felt like an alien. In fact, I never even felt that I was a person of color, especially when I was growing up, because all my friends were white. So I sort of I didn't think of it. It didn't really dawn upon me. And they didn't think of it. I mean, apparently, at least, I certainly never received any prejudice as far as I could tell. Maybe I just was blind to it, but I don't think so. They all accepted me as just another one of their little friends. But when I got into the Lovecraft field, I knew I was somewhat of an oddity in the sense that I was not white like Lovecraft. And so there was a convention, I can't remember which one this was, sometime in the mid-'80s, I think it was, maybe even earlier than that. And I was moderating a panel, not a sex, obviously, but just a Lovecraft panel. And it was written up by some, I think it was actually a Southern writer. I'm sorry, Jason, it was from North Carolina. Some guy from North Carolina wrote this up, you know, so yeah, this panel was moderated bizarrely by a Hindu. I met the guy later, he apologized, he didn't really mean it that way, but
Look at this panel. I mean,
this is really bizarre panel.
This is moderated by a Hindu.
And the thing is, I'm not a Hindu. I was never a Hindu except by birth. You know, I'm an Indian by birth, but I'm not a Hindu by religion. I was never a Hindu.
We're going to call you Swami.
Swami Chandraputra. You know?
We call it the little prince.
But that was funny. That was funny. But I was actually going to bring this back. Among the females who read Lovecraft, does it bother you that there are very few female characters in Lovecraft? That his worldview really is so male-oriented?
I really don't think about it. Oddly.
I think about it all the time, and I try to have as many women in my tales as possible. It's a very deliberate thing for me to have strong, cool, bizarre, powerful, strong, flawed, women characters in my fiction.
I think I misunderstood your question, ST.
Oh, so
I think you were saying, how do I feel about Lovecraft?
When you're reading Lovecraft stories,
most of my characters are female,
right.
of some stripe or
Yeah, well, I mean, especially initially when you were read Lovecraft,
right. I
didn't
think
bother
about
you.
it. No. I think at some point I tried so hard not to be offended by his ideas of homosexuality and things like that, but it's sort of at the same time, I loved what I was reading so much that I let it go over my head.
Yeah.
It provides you a challenge too.
Yeah.
Like you can never have had.
How do you love this man? I mean, I really have had people say, how can you possibly be such a proponent of this writer? And one day not long ago, I was sitting at my desk and, you know, the first shelf on my left there's like 2 shelves of Lovecraft and Lovecraft biographies and Lovecraft analysis and all this stuff. And it's like, and I said to Catherine, how the hell is it that this stuff is right here and so prominent, and I'm me? And I think there is a challenge.
But I mean, it seems odd that anybody would, you know, a reader, male or female, could only identify with a literary work that has a male or a female, you know, has somebody of their own gender in it. I mean, you know, my ex-wife, when she was in college, loved Moby Dick, but her professor actually said, how can you like Moby Dick? There are no females in there. Yeah, he almost was saying, you shouldn't like Moby Dick because you're a woman. I thought that was crazy. And it is crazy.
In academia, you encounter that. You encounter that now in academia a lot. You encounter it with radical feminism.
Yeah.
Boo. And radical feminism and lesbian separatists and all sorts of especially academic.
Yeah.
A lot of my favorite writers like Wilum.
Yeah, when I was a little girl, I started writing, I wrote my first science fiction story when I was 9. It was 55 pages long or something. And the reason I wrote it is because my father was a science fiction fanatic. He went to the library. The house was always full of science fiction. The heroes, as in Lovecraft, were always white males, usually older professors. They were scientists. They always solved the problems. And the only females in the books, as I always tell people, my friends know I say this all the time, the women, you know, they made the coffee and they stirred the brain stew, you know. They fed the nutrient lot to the brain broth or something. That's it, you know. They wore dresses. Sometimes they were a librarian, but that was it. They didn't have brains. They didn't solve the problems. They were never the scientists. And by 9, I wrote a pretty long story for a kid that age, featuring a female scientist who saves the day, and her sidekick, who just was along to provide muscle, was a guy. You know, it was a science fiction story. And then, you know, when I read Lovecraft, I read Conan an awful lot in my teens as well. It didn't bother me at all. You know, I was so used to it coming out of science fiction reading. I was so used to it just being guys. I just read it for the story. There are other things I loved about Lovecraft. I mean, he was a racist, all this kind of stuff. He hated women or whatever, but it didn't bother me. The stories just speak for themselves. But in my own work, it's very character-driven, and you know, it's always about pain and loss and identifying with my main character. You know, I just feel their pain so much. And I think that's a little different, something that I bring to it, maybe. I don't know. You call it my patented combination of
Pathos, yes.
That's what you call it.
Well, I get a little plug for one of my things. Someday, probably at least next year, the first of 2 volumes of a new anthology of mythos stories I've done will appear, called The Madness of Cthulhu. Basically, many of the stories, not all, but many of them use Athanasius of Madness as a springboard for their own creations. That anthology, 2-volume anthology, has Caitlin, has Lois, has Heather Graham. What are the females? There's several other females in that book. I mean, I hope they're just not token females, but a substantial portion of that book is written by females. And some male writers you wouldn't expect to have written, like Harry Turtledove, of all people, contributed a story, and Alan Dean Foster, who was here, of course, and Michael Shea, and a number of other people. Kevin J. Anderson wrote a fine story. So I'm glad of a good mix there of stories in that anthology. Maybe we should open up to questions, or do you have something else?
I was just going to recommend one writer who sticks out in my mind, the new writer, Molly Tanzer. She tackles Lovecraft in a really interesting way, just sitting here talking about feeling outside. Her characters all have the mad scientist intrigue, but they're all very sexual, and none of them seem uncomfortable. They all seem very comfortable in their skin, and so it's sort of the celebration of the things that have not been celebrated in Lovecraft. So I really recommend the collection, Pretty Mouth.
I think I actually blurbed it. It's really brilliant.
Well, I think it's time for questions. Jason?
I have one little comment. Well, you know, one thing, the hard-boiled field, which Lovecraft has some elements of, I think, in certain stories, women are like props. You know what I mean? They're just there to move the plot forward, and they're not significant characters, which I think is also a failing of that genre. But I noticed that weird fiction, it does attract a lot of people who I guess feel similarly about being outsiders, like you mentioned, feeling alien. In you too, Lois, but like I think of Billy Martin, you know, writing that kind of fiction, you know, not like Lovecraftian, but, you know, very disconcerting and disturbing at times. And also Jessica Amanda Salmonson, she's done that too. And I think that they have obviously all felt at different times very alienated or outside, you know, acceptance of society.
People who can't deny. Society demands of us that we are.
Society demands of us, you know, people like me and Amanda and Billy, that we are outsiders.
Yeah.
And we're still at that point in history.
Yeah.
And I don't like that, but I mean, I don't have any control over it either.
Let me put in also a little plug for Nancy Kilpatrick, I think an outstanding weird writer. She's in Madness too, and has done a lot of great writing.
One of our greatest editors is Ellen Datman.
Yes.
She's
And Paula Gura, another fine editor. I think somebody else had a comment?
I was surprised that the story He wasn't mentioned, as Lovecraft didn't have a lot of gay friends, and it seems fairly clear that that's at least somewhat inspired by, in the early days of the gay West Village, tourism.
Yeah, the story He, well, that's interesting. Where an older man, very old as it happens, actually comes from the colonial period, leads this narrator, clearly a male narrator, around, you know, the older parts of Greenwich Village, and you know, weird things happen. Was Village already gay back then? I'm not. Maybe it was, but I don't know. But I think, you know, I don't know that there's really overt or even undercurrent of sexuality there. I think the typical male pairing of that story is common in Lovecraft's other works as well, and it's common in, you know, literature as a whole at the time. You know, the Watson, Sherlock Holmes.
Pederasty.
Yeah. What?
Well, pederasty in the classical.
Well, whatever. But you know, I personally don't really have a sense of sexual undercurrent in that story, but maybe it's there also. Anybody else questions?
Would it be appropriate to think of Lovecraft as an early transhumanist? Were there others at that time period that had similar, possibly transhuman, contemporaries of his that they want to transcend?
I would say no, in the sense that transhumanism is so tied to technology. I don't see that in Lovecraft I don't know, the Migo thing, but that's clearly meant to be horrific. The idea of being a brain in a cylinder shot out into space, which I think modern, contemporary transhumanists, I know people who would really jump at that. I spend a lot of time in virtual worlds, and I know a lot of people who wish that that's where they spend all their time. But I would.
I think transhumanism is more positive oriented also.
It is, H+.
Yes.
If you, or
Lovecraft
H,
is not positive.
Yeah.
H negative.
We have a question
H
way in the
negative.
back.
is it H negative?
No, I was
Okay.
saying, no, I was saying Lovecraft is more.
Yes, H negative.
Yeah.
Yeah, this gentleman way in the back. Speak up, I'm hard of hearing.
Why Lovecraft and Sonia had no children?
No children. Well, remember, Lovecraft was 34 for one thing, and Sonia was almost 41 when they married. It would have been very hard for Sonia to conceive at that point, and I doubt that she wanted to conceive. She had a grown daughter, Florence, whom Lovecraft called this pert flapper daughter, and the daughter, Florence did not like Lovecraft, did not approve of her mother marrying Lovecraft, left the household when they married. Whether Sonia had birth control, I don't know, but I'm pretty certain she did not want to conceive again at that what would be considered an advanced age for a woman.
Plus she had a daughter from a previous marriage that
Yes.
she didn't even know. The daughter left and there was
Yeah.
no communication. I don't think she was too into having children.
Yeah.
Everything else aside, the financial considerations.
Yeah, she was working full time. She really was the major breadwinner. She wouldn't have been able to take a lot of time off to bear children. Anybody else have questions? Yeah, Howard, I have to confess, I think, how can I put this without offending people who like Howard? His work is much more unfiltered. That is to say, I think Howard was full of complexes, and that's okay. It's maybe that's what inspired him as a writer. I think he was a tormented individual, and sexual repression might have been one, and maybe a major element in his personality, and it comes out, I think, quite viscerally in his fiction, with these superhuman characters, super male and super female, exaggerated stereotypes of what men and women should be, and in that sense, it has a raw power that Lovecraft, who was much more subdued or subtle in that sense, doesn't have, perhaps, but I think it really came from a lot of these deep traumas that Howard was working through in his fiction. Anybody else?
You mentioned that Sonia was the only woman that is sexual.
So far as we know, she says that he was a virgin when they married.
And frankly, we don't know he had sex with someone.
I know.
Oh, she says that she had to initiate sexual
I want
activity.
photographs.
And that there's a famous thing what she says in a later interview. You allow me to demonstrate, Lois, it's very, very chaste, but she says the way that Lovecraft tried to get her excited was the famous pinky thing. He would say, and that was his way of inspiring her. well, how much that worked, I don't know. That's right, let's go to a room here.
Did it work, Lois?
There's another thing about Lovecraft. You know, he had younger female correspondents, didn't meet a lot of them, like C.L. Moore. He actually greatly admired C.L. Moore and wrote a lot of letters to her in the last couple of years of his life. But there's the famous story of Helen Sully, who was, I tell you, a beautiful young woman, friend of Clark Ashton's, but actually her mother, Genevieve Sully, I think probably would carry on a long-term affair with Smith, and Helen was her daughter. So around when she was 25, she went around the kind of Lovecraft circle, first to New York, and she says, or somebody, maybe Lovecraft says that Frank Long and Donald Waterwright wanted to fight a duel over her. She really was a peach. But then she came and visited Lovecraft in 1933, and Lovecraft, treated her very avuncularly, generally speaking. Led her around, the old sites as he loved to do when anybody visited Providence. Took her down to St. John's Churchyard, and it was getting to be evening, and there was a little bit of fog there, and getting kind of spooky, and he started telling her this extemporaneous horror story, and she got so alarmed and frightened that she rushed up there, went up to the street, and was clinging to this lamppost in terror, and Lovecraft came up, and she says there was a look of triumph in his eyes. I scared the willies out of that little girl. That's a great scene. He didn't make him pass at her, he just scared the willies out of her.
CNN wrote about setting up a woman later in life, who I believe was from the Boston area. Muriel that he says that. There was this, one of his revision clients, Hazel Heald, apparently kind of carried a torch for Lovecraft. We don't know much about her, really. I don't even know how old she was, maybe a couple years younger than Lovecraft, but she lived in Somerville, Massachusetts. And evidently, as Lovecraft was coming back from one of his visits to Quebec, I think probably 1933, I suspect, she invited him to have a candlelight dinner with him, with her, in her home in Somerville, and apparently had a candlelight dinner and left. Lovecraft said, "What the hell do you want me to do, lady? I'm out of here. Thanks for the meal. So I don't think it went on much farther than that. Anybody else? Well, I think we've had quite a bit to say on this subject, and I hope you've been informed and amused.